The Battle at Halbe. Halbe was once like 1,000 small towns dotted across Germany, timbered. Houses, merchants' halls, a market square, a church, a simple railroad station. Its buildings had been the homes of well-to-do farmers and dealers, neat and square. On this late April night, it was illuminated by parachute flares and by the flames, erupting from its tiled roofs and timber window shutters. I went up out of the cupola to see better and to guide my driver. The first thing that I saw in the gardens of the houses on the outskirts were the bodies of dead civilians strewn about everywhere, 20 or 30 people of all ages who seemed to have been caught by shellfire. We passed these pale bodies and followed the other panzers between the houses into the main street of the town. As we halted there, I took in the scene. Our King Tigers were positioned along the main street, their turrets level, with the upper windows of the old buildings. The Capo's Panther was in front of me. From behind us, German troops and civilians were starting to stream through the gaps in the houses and emerge into this main street, huddling close to the panzers. Some troops, those who retained combat discipline and were armed, moved slowly along the building frontages, checking for signs of red. Infantry. These men exchanged fire with Russians in the first houses, shooting through the windows and throwing in grenades to clear them out. Each shot and explosion made the civilians huddle closer to the panzers, and not only the civilians. Many German troops were unarmed and simply following us as non-combatants with no interest in sharing the fighting. These men, some walking, wounded but many able-bodied, let their comrades do the dangerous work. While they stayed back in the shadow of the panzers, overhead, the drifting parachute flares began to burn themselves out, and no more were fired from beyond the town. This meant that the Reds knew we had captured the place, and they wanted to give us no advantage of light. The fighting in the houses took place in a renewed darkness, lit by flames and gun flashes, with men scrambling among the wreckage of the house fronts and doorways. I saw the German infantry drag the remaining Reds out by their collars and belts, throwing them onto the cobblestones and surrounding them. To save ammunition, they killed the prisoners with their rifle butts, boots, and with entrenching spades, clubbing and stabbing them to death. The civilians peered around the panzers to witness this killing. Old men, women, and children too. By the time this was done, this end of the street was littered with mangled Red corpses, visible in the fires of the burning buildings. With the street secured, it was the stage to move on and through the town, to the west. Looking behind us, I could make out a great river of people on foot, horses, carts, and unarmored vehicles, bulging up in this bottleneck of the main street. As the King Tigers moved ahead, screened by the combatant infantry, our two Panthers moved off slowly after them, and the mass of people to our rear followed too. At first, they stayed behind our Panther, but then in a few meters, many of them ran past us, weaving between the bodies along the street, stumbling from one Panzer to the next, until the whole street was packed with thousands of people on foot, all rushing towards the other side of the town. When this surge of people was at its height, and the street was a dense, moving river of human heads swirling forwards between the panzers like islands. In a flood, at this point, the Red artillery opened fire on the town. Of course, the Reds had their observers hidden nearby, communicating the situation to their commanders, and they had plotted the coordinates of the main street carefully in advance. Even so, the bombardment that they unleashed on the street was merciless and devastating in its accuracy. The first shell exploded behind us, throwing a large number of people into the air and sending broken cobblestones whirling along the narrow transit. Like missiles, the shells burst in a calculated line going forward, from the rear of the column towards the front. The explosions ripped the tightly packed crowd apart, sending some bodies crashing against the house fronts and others through the shattered windows of the storefronts. I caught sight of a soldier and a civilian woman blasted off their feet and blown into a shop where they lay among the burning goods while the building caught fire around them. My driver shouted a question to me. "Shall I advance at speed, Herr Feldwebel, to reach the other end of the street?" I tried to see in front of us. The King Tigers were accelerating, and as they picked up speed to get away from the explosions, they struck and crushed many people on foot around them. Some bodies were thrown sideways, while others were dragged under the huge metal treads or simply disappeared beneath the King Tiger's massive hull. At the same time, the artillery increased even more in intensity, with rounds bursting in the street and against the buildings every few seconds, both explosive rounds and incendiary rockets. At this point, the road in front of my Panther exploded in a spray of white fire, a light so intense that it hurt my eyes to look at it even through the periscopes. I recognized this as a magnesium or phosphorus shell, and I felt the heat surge over our Panzer as the fire grew. The burning chemical expanded in the air, creating huge spirals that grew to a height of several meters against the frontage of the house beside the street. The building began to burn as the white substance dripped like a molten waterfall down its surface. There were civilians in the building, and I saw some of them try to jump out through windows away from the fire, but the blazing chemical kept expanding and caught the people as they leaped. They fell completely on fire into the street, and the entire house began to collapse on top of them where they lay. In front of us was an armored car, an 8-wheeled command vehicle, and this car reversed suddenly away from the flames, hitting our front plate. With a substantial impact, I heard the car rev and its wheels scream as they span on the cobbles, but my radio man called up to me that the vehicle's rear fender was jammed under our front plate. There was a flash from the car itself, and flames began to spread up its angular surface. Its crew began to jump from the upper hatches. It seemed that the armored car's fuel tank was split and leaking, and the gasoline was pouring onto the street under our Panzer. Shells were bursting around us too, and the front of the burning building was collapsing into the street. I told my driver to take us forward, regardless of what was in front of us. We crushed the rear of the armored car and bulldozed it aside. The Panther reared up into the air as we lurched over the rubble of the collapsed house, through the phosphorus flames, and into the street beyond. Here, in the light of the flames, I could see some of our Volkssturm infantry fighting with more red soldiers who were firing from behind a wrecked T-34. We bulldozed the red Panzer, pushing it aside and crushing some of the Russian infantry who were behind it. I saw that the survivors were set upon by our Volkssturm men, who knocked them down with carbine butts, and even Panzerfausts, which they wielded as clubs. As the Reds were subdued, hundreds of people began to surge forward again along the street, making for the far end. Behind us, the bombardment continued in its ferocious intensity. I ordered the driver not to accelerate, as I could not bear the thought of crushed women and children under my tracks, however great the danger from the bombardment. As it was, the crowds were surging and scrambling away from the central part of the street, fighting each other to get into the smashed house, fronts into the side alleyways, or even under the trees that lined the edges of the boulevard to find any shelter from the explosions. Those that made it to the edges cowered there, squeezed against each other, and transfixed in confusion, while those still in the middle of the street charged madly towards the far end, where they knew the route to the west lay. Slowly, the space in front of us was cleared of people. As the street emptied, we were able to pick up speed, and we traveled at about 20 km/h for a short distance, aiming for the western end, which was framed between two high houses. I was still up out of the turret with masonry and shrapnel whipping around me, and a few of our complement of riders was still crouched on our engine deck, clinging frantically to the grills and equipment hooks. I thought that we were going to be successful and reach the western end. But without warning, one of the King Tigers appeared in front of us, actually reversing backwards between the final houses into the main street. Again, his exhausts flaring. He came to a halt, traversing his turret, and began firing with his barrel below horizontal at something in the space beyond the street, which we could not see around the corner of the houses. I had the feeling now that the Reds were playing with us, simply maneuvering us around for their sport. They had allowed our column to enter and fill the narrow street, then started their bombardment just as our people were, at their most exposed. Now they were blocking us off, sealing us into this death channel, with most of our heavy panzers already out somewhere beyond the edge of the town. Another artillery round exploded behind our Panther, and I heard screams from my rear deck as shrapnel cut into the people riding on our hull. Debris smashed off my cupola and hit me in the back, and I dropped down in two. The turret with stabs of pain shooting through my spine. I grabbed the 75mm gun. Breached for support, and the loader steadied me and unfastened my jacket to see. The wound. Outside the Panther, metal was breaking in waves against our armor, plate, and making our machine rock like a boat. The pain in my back prevented me from thinking about the effect of the explosions on the people taking cover in the street. At times, as the loader probed my back injury, I could hear long screams from outside in the brief intervals between the explosions and the King Tiger firing his gun. I think that I also heard people beating and pounding on our armor, trying to climb aboard or calling desperately for help. At one moment, the open hatch of the cupola was filled with the hysterical, screaming face of a woman, begging to come into the Panzer. I would have permitted her, but another shell exploded close to us, and she disappeared in a plume of smoke and debris. Halbe was being systematically destroyed, I realized, from one end to the other end, second by second. I grunted as my loader removed the second of two shell splinters from my back and then splashed antiseptic on the wound. I shuddered in pain, but was still grateful that I was inside the Panther, and not outside in the raging maelstrom of the street. I gulped down an amphetamine tablet and let the loader give me a short jab from a morphine capsule, enough to deaden the pain, but not enough to knock me out. I felt numb, wooden, and my limbs became distant from my body. I looked through the periscopes forward and saw the King Tiger in front of us, advancing slowly, surrounded by a mob of armed soldiers, civilians, and others. There was a Kubelwagen, VW Jeep, beside the rear of the Panzer, and soldiers were fighting for space inside it, raining blows on each other. One man raised a pistol and shot an officer through the chest, and then the King Tiger jerked sideways as it accelerated, its massive tracks crushing the Kubelwagen, the officer, and the mutinous soldier, destroying them and others under its treads. With explosions blowing slabs of masonry off the walls of the houses around us and entire buildings collapsing in bursts of smoke, we advanced. Behind the King Tiger, out of the main street, being forced to drive over the crushed Kubelwagen and its shattered human debris as we progressed. Rounding the corner, I saw what the King Tiger had been firing at. A pair of T-34 Panzers were wedged between two buildings, their front hulls shot away, and the bodies of their crews burning as they hung out of the hatches. Was that the Reds' last ambush, or were there more tricks still to come? Around us, the ragged mass of our foot travelers scuttled and jumped alongside our Panther. This road had fewer opportunities for cover than the main street, being open on one side, but this allowed the people to spread out into the fields to the left in an attempt to avoid the exploding shells, which were falling all around us. In all my experience in the East, I had not seen a bombardment this intense, shells landing one on top of the other, the dust cloud of one explosion being torn apart by the explosion of the next round, and among them, the incendiary rockets crashing and exploding across the street and the open spaces. Perhaps it was the amphetamine cocktail, but I grew immune to the sight of these rockets bursting among the hundreds of people who swarmed beside us, sending dozens of them tumbling in grotesque somersaults with their bodies on. Fire, their burning limbs carving patterns on my retina as they flailed in the dim light. A pair of horses pulling a cart were set on fire, and they stampeded, insanely throwing the civilians in the cart out behind them as they kicked and trampled on anyone unlucky enough to be in their path until an artillery shell killed the animals in a puff of whirling flesh. Several times we had to halt while the king tiger in front of us dealt with threats that appeared from one side or another, its turret traversing and spitting tracer from its coaxial machine gun into the night. The great Panzer had a group of SS troops on its back hull, and these men fired with MP-40 and heavy machine guns into the houses as they saw enemy troops lurking in there. We came on a partly collapsed building which had Red troops firing from the rubble. An anti-tank rocket flew out from this strong point in a trail of fire and exploded against one of the huge concave wheels of the King Tiger. The wheel flew off, spinning like a coin, and for a moment I thought that the Panzer was doomed. But the SS men leaped from the hull and stormed the Red position, throwing themselves onto the enemy guns. The surviving Reds swarmed out, firing their machine pistols into the mass of troops and civilians, running and swerving among the throng and shooting at random. I pulled myself up through the hatch to see what was happening and grabbed my machine pistol, climbing out onto the hull when I realized what was taking place. In the light of the burning buildings, I could see these 10 or 12 Red troops who knew they were about to die but wanted to take as many Germans as possible with them, running madly through the ranks, shooting and yelling. Half of the Reds were felled in moments by shots or blows, and they disappeared under German boots as they were kicked and mauled to death. But others charged into a mass of civilians, shooting and cutting down women and children with sustained bursts of fire. One of these attackers was killed when an incendiary rocket landed near him, bounced into the air and decapitated him as he ran. His body ran on for several meters, still firing his gun until it stumbled and fell. I jumped off the Panther, feeling no pain from my wounds, and shot down 2 of the other Reds as they ran berserk among the fleeing civilians. Some of our troops came to my aid, shooting at the Reds and bringing them down, but many others, even those who had guns, were rooted to the ground with exhaustion or fear and simply watched us as we, the more determined fighters, took on the enemy. In seconds, we had shot down all these Ivans, and the civilians were searching their bodies for food and pistols, even as the corpses steamed in the flickering light. I clambered back onto the Panther, my body still numb, my mind clouded. We drove on down this exit street for 50 meters, then 100 meters away from the most intense area of bombardment, the artillery barrage. Slackened here, with the Red guns still focusing on the central part of the town, where a dreadful massacre must surely be taking place. Looking back to the central area, I could make out a mass of people. Not hundreds, but many thousands of them, crawling out from the street exit, dragging themselves away from the fire zone. Behind them, the buildings of central Halbe were completely aflame, and shells were still bursting over the houses with a frantic rhythm. What was the fate of the thousands who were still trying to break through back there, through the rockets and shell bursts in between the collapsed houses? As if in answer to my question, a truck appeared in the exit from the main street, an open vehicle with a cab and a flat body. The body was loaded with troops and civilians, their bodies streaming with smoke and sparks. The truck was on fire, with flames erupting from its engine, and it careered out of control into the crowd in the open space, running down many people who were then left where they fell. The truck rolled to a halt, and the flames around it grew and began to roar. I saw that none of the people on its body tried to move, dismount, or climb off, either too badly hurt, too terrified, or too uncaring of their fate. They remained piled on the truck while it exploded into flames, and the fire consumed them rapidly. I looked ahead again towards the darkness at the end of this road. A shadowy space not illuminated by flares, fires, or explosions. Beside us, the survivors on foot herded forward, following the panzers towards their hope of safety. We slowed to walking pace as I crouched on the turret top, communicating with my driver through the interphone, trying to make out what was ahead of us. I could not see the King Tigers, but I made out the exhausts of the Capo's Panther in the darkness, progressing slowly at an even pace. After several hundred meters, I noticed the people on the ground around us beginning to pick up speed, starting to run with their remaining energy towards the dark but silent area ahead. Motorcycles, trucks, and horses streamed past us, dim shapes in the gloom, these vehicles and carts swerving among the foot traffic. All of us, racing for the way out of Halbe. "It seems that we are through, sir," my gunner said in my earphones. "There is nothing beyond. It looks like the road going west." I grunted a response, partly in doubt, partly because the pain of my back wound was starting to lever into my senses. My back was cool and wet, and I touched it to find it slick with blood. Perhaps when we were finally through, when we were crossing the land beyond Halbe, then I could find a medic and have the wounds dressed. "I really think we're through," my driver said from his position down in the front hull. "I can see a sign ahead. What does it say, sir?" I peered into the dark, my vision doubling as if I was drunk. There was a sign there, some kind of placard on a roadside tree, white with black letters, and as we approached, I saw that it was a hand-painted route marker. I told the driver to rotate right and to advance slowly towards the station. The mass of people around us swarmed together, reading the sign, shouting out, in hopes of deliverance, believing they were almost out of the Kessel. After 100 meters, we passed a solitary German soldier in a clean, tidy uniform, a man who appeared well-fed and healthy. I was so accustomed to the sight of our ragged, patched-up infantry that I noted this immediately, even in the moonlight and in my drugged state. He directed us to the right, using a field police direction pointer, and he saluted professionally. I did not have time to note his insignia, and anyway, the light was getting too dim. Following his directions, we progressed right, and in a few moments I saw the Iron Foot bridge of the railway station in front of us under the moon. More of these clean, professional German soldiers appeared beside the road, waving us forward and pointing to the station area. "We're through," my driver said. "See these field police fellows? They must have come up from the 12th Army Zone. We'll be linking up soon, sir, won't we?" "If they're the 12th Army, they're too far forward," my gunner said. "They should be 30 kilometers to the west." I nodded at his comment, looking at another of the field police in his smartly pressed uniform as he waved us onto the station zone. I suddenly shouted to my driver to halt, and the Panther ground to a stop in a swirl of dust and earth. The foot traffic did not halt, but surged around us, a multitude of troops, civilians, and wheeled transports following the police directions to the station. Even the troops clinging to our rear deck jumped off, now that we were halted, and joined the crowd surging forward along the road. I looked down at the field policeman, his eyes invisible under the rim of his helmet, and his uniform devoid of insignia. "What unit are you with?" I called to him over the noise of explosions from the town and the tramping of the foot soldiers charging past towards the station. "Field Police Herr Feldwebel," the man saluted. I climbed down from the Panther slowly, with pain rippling through my spine, and stood in front of him. The hundreds of foot soldiers and civilians charged around us, shouting encouragement to each other. "Which unit of field police?" I asked the man, over the heads of the people rushing between us. "You must hurry, Herr Feldwebel," he called to me. "The Reds are close." Which unit of police? I shouted, being rocked and jostled by the many. Troops rushing past. A civilian woman passed between us, dragging a child in. Each hand, children of 5 or 6 years, trailing their feet in exhaustion. The rail station, she was saying. We will be safer there. Which unit are you with? I shouted to the field police soldier. Which unit? He was gone. He had retreated into the shadows away from the road, and I caught sight of his back as he ducked between trees in the pasture, dodging away from us. Seydlitz Truppe, I yelled. These are Seydlitz men. The Seydlitz men were a curse on us all. Seydlitz troops were German soldiers who had surrendered to the Reds in at the east and had agreed to work for them to disrupt our lines and cause confusion. I had heard of them often, but never seen one until now. They were notorious for exactly this. Wearing German uniforms, they planted false signposts, directed traffic wrongly, and fouled up the plans of entire regiments. Hundreds of people began breaking and running past our panzer towards the station. I could see them, converging in the moonlight on the access road, running, limping, dragging themselves towards what they thought was safety. These are Seydlitz men, I shouted to the onrushing troops, trying to push them back. Several of them halted, and a knot of troops and civilians gathered around me, but the vast bulk of this tide of people surged on past us. I shouted to them to stop, to stay away from the station, to ignore the signs. Inside the station, the shooting began within seconds. I saw the muzzle flashes light up the footbridge in the darkness, not only from one side, but from both ends of the site. Screams tore the air among the rapid, unceasing machine gun shots, and the crowd surging to the station. Faltered, stumbled, and many fell. The people behind them, though, were confused and running blindly, not seeing where the shots were coming from. And they kept rushing on, trampling and stamping on those who were falling. Within seconds, in addition to the massacre taking place inside the station, the ground around our panzer was strewn with wounded and trampled foot soldiers, civilians and children, as the crowd broke and began to run wildly for any available cover. I leaped back onto the Panther and ordered the driver to advance on the station. That was hopeless, though. The entrance area was thick with people, especially civilians with carts, huddling together and not knowing which way to turn. The shooting from the station reached a crescendo, and grenades began to explode in there, with the characteristic hollow crack of the Soviet bombs that spread such vicious splinters. The dim landscape was lit by these flashes, and by the shouts and screams of the trapped victims from within the station precincts, and still by the fires and detonations of the bombardment in Halbe itself. A soldier came running out of the station, his face a mask of blood, his eyes wide and staring. "Make the people follow you," he shouted to me. "They will follow a Panzer, Herr Feldwebel. Lead them away from the station, for God's sake." But the people in the station, "They are dead, all dead," he shouted. "Lead these others away in the name of God." We drove the Panther slowly away from the station, across the open ground, scattering the milling crowds of leaderless, confused soldiers and frantic civilians. They formed up behind us in the constant manner of stragglers, and stumbled after us as we moved away. I dreaded encountering landmines in this open space or a return of the intense artillery bombardment. But we entered a heathland punctuated by bracken and scrub, in which, with only the moonlight and distant flames, it was difficult to make out any way ahead. A civilian man who knew the area climbed up beside me, and with his directions we crawled away from Halbe, picking up a narrow road that crossed the Halbe rail line at a barrier point. This crossing was strewn with abandoned trucks and equipment, and beyond it the road led west through overhanging trees going into a forest. There were flashes here as artillery shells exploded in the fields on either side, but these were fired randomly and caused only limited casualties to the massed ranks behind us. It became too dark to navigate or to steer, and the danger of shedding a track or grounding the panther and damaging. Its running gear was a constant anxiety. A shape loomed up in front of us with two red, glowing stacks, and we almost collided with the capo's panther, which was stationary at a curve in the forest track. We took the decision to halt and move on at first light. A few minutes later, at around 2 a.m, our two panthers were concealed under trees off the road, and the horde of infantry and others who had followed us away from the station were finding places to lay themselves down on the pine needles between the tree trunks. From among the infantry, we posted a perimeter guard, and then we broke into a forestry hut that our civilian guide found for us. Inside, in the dark, the capo said, "So we are through Halbe. The King Tigers are somewhere ahead now. We have simply lost touch with them. We must carry on by ourselves for now. We have to watch out for those Seydlitz men. I hear that the station was packed, with dead bodies 3 or 4 deep." "We can identify the Seydlitz men by their uniforms," I said. "They are clean and well presented, unlike our troops." The capo peered through the window shutter at the crowds of troops and civilians outside. "Our troops know that the war is lost," he said. "How many want to fight?" "Now? Only a quarter or a third of our men will fight any longer. The rest will let others fight for them." "Then we will fight with the quarter or the third," I said. The capo lit a kerosene lamp on minimum light and unfolded a map. "I took this from a dead artilleryman," he said. "See here, it shows where we are." He showed me our location. We were in a triangular stretch of woodland, southwest of Halbe, which was bisected by the country railroad and by various forestry tracks. The map extended west to the Elbe itself, where the 12th Army were holding open the corridor that would lead us to the Americans. Between our patch of forest and the 12th Army were 2 remaining milestones to cross. First, the north-south Autobahn that ran up and down this part of Germany, dead straight. We believed that the Russians had just charged up this Autobahn in their advance on Berlin itself to the north. If so, most of their forces would be fighting in Berlin, leaving the rural hinterland thinly guarded. "That's the plan," the capo said. "And after we cross the Autobahn, we have to cross the railroad line, about 20 kilometers further. After that, we should find the 12th Army boys waiting for us, and then, hello America." His finger moved across the map, the Autobahn, the railroad, and then the River Elbe. I laughed in a grim way, but that only made the pain in my back sharper. In the past, I had slept easily enough in a Panzer, the thin metal chair. Made a good perch, and you rested your head on the turret wall or on the gun breech, with your forehead on your linked fingers for a pillow. If you were in the Panzer all night, a shell case was your toilet, and fresh air came from opening the hatch to empty it. In this way, 3 men could pass the night in the turret cage, and the other 2 crewmen on their seats in the hull. On that night in the woodland west of Halbe, though, I did not want to sleep. I took another mouthful of amphetamines, painkillers, and schnapps. The forest around my panther was not sleeping either. It was filled with voices, cries, the wailing of children and the sound of equipment being readied for our next stage of the breakout. Searching for aspirin, I fumbled in my tunic pocket and found the photo of the young woman that the lady on the Panther's deck had given me before she died. A gray light was coming through the cupola, and I climbed out to examine the photo more fully. The girl was a beauty, and like all
lonely soldiers, I imagined that she might be good, understanding company for a
man such as me. There was an address on the back, a town to the west of the Elbe in the American-occupied sector of Germany. There was no name for the girl. I smiled and put the photo safely in my pocket again. A few birds were singing, but that stopped as the sound of bombardment grew from the countryside to our west. Close at hand, in the forest, there was more noise, shouting and cursing, and people clamoring for attention. I went into the trees to see what this was. I found a scrum of our soldiers, hunched over something on the ground in the dawn light. I pushed through them, and with the authority that came from a panzer uniform at this point in the fighting, the infantry made way for me slowly. I found that a group of German troops had found a Seydlitz man. The Seydlitz agent was pressed back against the roots of a tree, clenching, his fists gritting his teeth. His field gray uniform had a German eagle, but no swastika, and one of our men handed me an armband that had been in the Seydlitz man's pocket. This was what the Seydlitz agents called their organization. Looking around, I realized that the small crowd did not only contain soldiers. Various German women were present, some of them armed, and also a handful of children and youths of about 10 years to maybe 15 years of age. One of the women stepped forward and threw a rope upward over the branch of the nearest tree. An aircraft flew overhead, then another 2 planes, so low that their slipstream shook the tree canopy. I heard their cannon firing into the forest to the east, and then the slow thump of exploding vehicles from somewhere over there. With this background, the Seydlitz man was hanged on the tree, his throat emitting a dreadful rattle, while the circle of troops, youths and women, watched. His jerking, kicking heels were seized by a German boy of 10 or 12 years, who swung and pulled on them to break the Seydlitz man's neck and silence the hideous sounds that were coming from his mouth. "It is not decent," I heard the boy say to his mother as the hanged man's feet swung around silently in a circle above us. "Such sounds are not decent in a German forest." The Autobahn and the railroad. We moved slowly out to the main path, which was already filling up with mismatched human and vehicle traffic that had entered this patch of forest. During darkness, having traversed the nightmare of Halbe itself, we set our compass and aimed west. I moved ahead of the Capo's Panther, and together, our 2 panzers advanced at walking pace with frequent stops in the pearlescent light of the spring morning. On our left, incendiary explosions rolled. Across the horizon and from the Panther's cupola, I could see trees in the distance, fields being blown up and set on fire by the blasts. I believed that the unit there were the remains of our 21 St. Division Panzer Grenadiers holding back the Reds from our columns. At times, wounded infantry would appear in the pastures near the road, limping or carrying their comrades. They told us that the line was holding over there, but the Reds were constantly probing our flanks with their panzers, infantry, and Seydlitz men. The Sturmovicks came over us repeatedly, so often that the air was almost never free of the scream of their engines. There was a flak gun on a broken down half-track at one point in a copse near the road, manned by a crew of Hitler Youth, Luftwaffe men, and civilian girls. This ragged crew threw off their camouflage netting and foliage and fired up at the swooping red aircraft. They managed to hit one plane, sending tracer through one wing and causing a huge plume of flame to erupt from it. The Sturmovik flipped onto its back with metal debris streaming out in the flames in its slipstream and crashed into the forest. Ahead, the victory was momentary. The following 2 planes spotted the flak at once and raked it with their incendiary shells, leaving the bodies of the crew burning among the barrels of their gun. In the early light, the Russian forces tested us and pushed at our lines. Our 2 Panthers were moving with a group of about 500 infantry and civilians who had come through Halbe with us, and we were in no condition to withstand a sustained attack from the flanks. As the sun rose, my worst fears in this respect became a reality. Through the trees, we saw that 3 Joseph Stalin panzers had appeared. Outside the forest, on the distant heath, patrolling across the open land and traversing their turrets as they surveyed our segment of the woodland. We immediately halted, trusting that our vehicles were screened by the trees, and we watch the Stalins as they prowled across the landscape out there. To engage. Then would surely bring a further detachment of red panzers down upon us, leading to the destruction of the few hundred people we had brought through. From Halbe, our column of foot soldiers and civilians, meanwhile, threw themselves onto the forest floor and drove their animals off among the trees. In moments, our 1,000 pairs of eyes were watching silently as the 3 Stalins moved slowly past our part of the tree line at a distance of about 1 kilometer from us. I was inside the turret, and my gunner had his face to the gun sight, with his hand on the firing lever, his feet moving the turret fractionally to keep the Stalins in his scope. I could see the sweat dripping down the side of his neck and the quiver in his fingers as he held the lever. For a panzer commander, one immediate tactical decision in a concealment situation is whether to shut down your vehicle's engine or not. The engine, even when idling, is noisy, and if the enemy for some reason shuts off his engine, he will hear you, or if the enemy is accompanied by an infantry screen, they will hear you if they move away from the sound of their own panzers. On the other hand, if you turn your engine off, there is the danger that it may be slow to start if you need to move away urgently, and also, without the transmission running under the turret, you can only traverse your turret slowly with the hand crank. Weighing this up, I kept the engine running, because the enemy Stalins were still some distance away, and I could see no infantry with them. As another precaution, I ordered my loader to load high explosive and have a round of armor-piercing ready in his hands. Like the T-34s against the King Tigers, I knew that the best way to deal with a bigger, heavier tank was to blow its tracks off with the first shot and then to use a penetrating round. The 3 Stalins came closer and then halted, trailing fumes at a range of barely 6 to 800 meters outside the trees. I swallowed. The Stalins spewed out exhaust smoke and then continued their slow progress past us. 500 hearts were pounding in rhythm with their engines, I am sure. As they began to depart, the rearmost Stalin turned its turret to us and fired a long burst of machine gun from its coaxial along our tree line.
The bullets ripped up the trees at head height and ricocheted off the hull of our
Panther, and then ceased. Apparently satisfied, the Stalin moved on slowly. I breathed in deep relief, but as I did so, a civilian man bolted out from the trees beside us, waving his arms in surrender. "Scheisse, he's gone mad under the pressure," my radio man said. The civilian was an elderly man, and he was followed by 2 more people, a woman and a girl, who were either seeking to surrender also, or trying to restrain their relative before he gave us all away. I then saw a Wehrmacht soldier near my panzer stand up, aim with his carbine, and shoot the 3 people. Down one after the other. They tumbled and fell like rabbits in the long grass. I had no time for sympathy. I was watching that last Stalin, the great panzer, halted and rotated its hull to face onto us. He saw the shooting, my driver said, or he saw the people running. Our luck was that bad that the Stalin commander had seen the civilians run and fall, and he wanted to know why. The Stalin fired a shot, a high explosive round which burst in the trees above and sent shrapnel and wood blasting down around us. A group of civilians was hit, and they began charging, in panic, out onto the heath. Several soldiers also went out, with their hands raised. They were immediately cut down by the Stalin's machine gun, which swept across them at neck height, decapitating many of the men. They're headless. Bodies slumped down with their hands still raised. The other 2 Stalins turned, front onto us, and began firing their main guns into the woods also. The rounds tore open the tree line in front of us, and despite the smoke, the many people running and hiding on the edge of the forest must now have become visible. A tree crashed to earth, revealing our Panther fully. In some ways, I was relieved. Now we were to fight as panzer men again, machine against machine, and not hide with the old men and the fearful woman in the forest. I ordered my gunner to fire the high-explosive round in the breech. Our round was laid perfectly, and it exploded just right of center against the front plate of that Stalin which had discovered us. Through the periscope, I saw its drive wheel go spinning away, dragging the track with it, the Stalin's. Barrel was still lowered for its lengthy reloading, and for these few moments the red Panzer was vulnerable. We fired again with the armor piercing, and this shot struck the Stalin. On the gun mantle, I saw the whole turret jerk with the concussion as metal. Debris flew around the machine. The Stalin began trying to reverse, keeping its front facing to us, but its missing track meant that it moved slowly, and was, dragging itself at an angle. If that red driver panicked now and accelerated, the single track would slew the whole vehicle sideways and present its thinner flank. Armor to us. I ordered my gunner to hold fire unless this happened. Meanwhile, we advanced out of the trees, onto the flat land, to engage the enemy with freedom of movement. To my right, the Capo's Panther was firing on the other two Stalins, his tracer rebounding off one of them, hitting the other, and deflecting from that one. Off into the heathland. The Capo too moved out onto the heath, halting to aim his. Next shot. A round from one of the Stalins hit his turret top and ricocheted off, carving a path through the trees between us. I saw that a group of our infantry were approaching those two Stalins from the side with Panzerfausts, and it appeared the Russian crews had not seen them. I heard my gunner grunt in anticipation and saw that the disabled Stalin had begun to speed up, the movement turning its flank towards us. The Stalin twitched as the single track gripped the ground, and in a spray of dust, it began to turn sideways on, with its big silhouette clear in the morning haze. My gunner put his shot cleanly through the lower hull, just above the running gear. For a moment, the Stalin kept moving as if the round had not penetrated, but then the turret began to traverse wildly, and the whole machine began to shudder. I knew what was happening in there. The exploding ammunition in the hull was building up a blast wave of pressure which would inevitably rip the turret from the hull or split the hull itself open. No Panzer ever built could withstand such internal pressures. Indeed, the Stalin's long, oblong turret suddenly rose up into the air, lifted by a flash of expanding flame, and tumbled over, spilling out the bodies of the turret crew. The hull lay juddering, sending out spirals of exploding ammunition into the morning light. Both our Panthers focused now on the two remaining Stalins. Those ready gun barrels were elevated again, and from the traversing of their turrets I saw that they were both taking aim at my Panther. I told my driver to accelerate, out, into the heath, hoping that we could move faster than their turrets could turn. At the same time, we traversed our turret rapidly onto them, finishing our short run, with a slew to one side to bring our gun more quickly around to aim at the Reds. A few seconds of shouted commands, my gunner rotating the turret a few centimeters and operating the gun elevation for his final calculations. Just as the Stalins turned their massive guns directly onto us, my gunner was able to get a shot onto the nearest one, a shot which at this close range split open the top of the turret where it joined the side. I saw the projectile exit the turret through the hatch, carrying with it parts of the crew's bodies and bits of machinery. The open hatch emitted thick smoke, and the lower hull crew began to clamber out. The other Stalin, before it could get a shot at us, was hit by a Panzerfaust. I saw our men advancing to the machine's rear, ducking as they scrambled. Across the scrubland from the woods, I saw the long, fiery trail of a Panzerfaust, rocket, and then the explosion from the engine compartment which sent a torrent of fuel spilling out onto the heath. That crew also climbed out of their Panzer, and in a few seconds our men had rounded up half a dozen of these Russian crew. Men standing around them with their guns trained on them while our two Panthers drove back to the road through the forest. We had won this small battle, against great odds, but the smoke from the burning Stalins was marking our position clearly, even in the morning mist, and for every Stalin that we destroyed, 5 could come to take its place. As we regained the road, with the Kapo's Panzer in front, I saw that our infantry were shooting the captured Red crewmen, cutting them down one by one with single rounds. Then our men searched the bodies, removing what appeared to be cigarettes and items of food. Our troops had descended this low, scavenging scraps from enemy corpses. I told my driver to make the fastest possible speed on this narrow, uneven road. It was imperative that we get away from that scene urgently. I went up, through the hatch, and looked around. The 500 or so infantry and civilians were forming up behind us, hobbling, limping, or walking in our wake. If I expected congratulations on our rapid battle, none were forthcoming. The wounded were in their own world, and the civilians were ashen-faced and trembling. The mist overhead began to burn off in the sunlight. In a few minutes, the bombing began again, with Sturmovix passing overhead and dropping bombs at random through the leaf cover. I stood on the rear deck as wounded men and exhausted civilians began to drag themselves up on board, and I considered the state of the Panther. We'd had fuel for another 20 kilometers at best. The transmission was almost worn out. The engine was running hot, and the tracks needed to be removed, tightened, and their connecting pins checked. A procedure that would take half a day under normal circumstances. Our main gun ammunition was down to a handful of rounds, with almost none left for the machine guns. Our radio had stopped functioning properly, and we had no fire extinguisher or spare oil. The superb slab-sided Panther kept rolling west at a walking pace, but for how much longer? This road passed through an area where the Russians had fought running battles with our forces in the days before. The forest was strewn with wrecked vehicles, both German and Russian. We passed a series of German ambulance vans in which each of the wounded men had been shot in the head. The discovery gave renewed impetus to our column's march, as our 2 panzers and then the infantry and foot followers filed past the human remains, even as our loader jumped down to tap the vans for any possible fuel. We stopped at any intact vehicles that we found to check them for fuel. In the tanks, but somebody had been through the area ahead of us and drained every drop. There was a T-34 still in one piece, surrounded by the bodies of its crew, but the Russian panzers ran on diesel, not gasoline, and that fuel would cause our Maybach engines to foul up. The need for gasoline was becoming desperate and preying on my mind as much as the explosions from aircraft and artillery, which echoed around us. Around midday, in a clearing which was untouched by the battles, we came upon a remarkable thing. It was a Panther. The Panzer was stationary, halted among the ferns apparently, undamaged. It appeared to be virtually new, its paint unchipped in its tracks. Perfectly tensioned, with no mud or debris in them, its hatches were closed, and its gun was level. We halted and observed it for a minute. There was no sign of life. I walked across to the Kapo's Panzer, climbed up among his wounded, and discussed this with him. "No markings or signs," the Kapo said, squinting at the beautiful, unmarked Panther in the dappled light. "It's just been abandoned, perhaps. Maybe it ran out of fuel, but then why did the crew not blow it up with the demolition charge? Maybe the crew surrendered or were killed outside the vehicle," I said. "It could be full of gasoline and ammunition. It might start at the first try." The Capo looked at me. "You suggest leaving your Panther and taking that Panther? Or putting our radio man in that one? He can drive well enough, and he has no radio or gun ammunition anyway. We can pick up more Panzer crewmen along the road. Then we will have a force of 3 Panthers." The Capo rubbed his chin. "But who would leave a Panzer there like that? It looks like a red trick, too." "Me. as if they captured a panther and then left it here as a trap. "Let me take a look, Herr Leutnant." "Be very quick and be careful." I went over to the panther and looked around it. I could see no cables or tripwires, and the ground appeared undisturbed. The machine looked the way that my machine used to, pristine, well-maintained, and very potent. I climbed up onto it and tried the commander's hatch. It slid to one side easily. I waited for a few seconds. There was an explosion which sent a torrent of fire up into the air to a height of 20 meters. I could hear debris flying around inside the Panzer as its ammunition detonated, and then, as I jumped clear and ran, the fuel tanks blew up with a force that suggested they had been completely full. I stumbled as a fireball rose over the Panther, and it was covered in burning gasoline. As I picked myself up, the capo laughed and ordered us to move on quickly. "You thought it was Christmas morning, Faust," he shouted at me. "You thought the Reds gave you a new Panther. But the Reds know how to set a trap, that's for sure." We left the magnificent Panther burning there, as the trees around it caught fire, and the Sturmovik aircraft overhead began to swarm towards the smoke.